What is up, everybody? Mr. Percy here. Welcome to our AP World Cram session. We're doing Africa. Really a lot of focus on sub-Saharan Africa, but we'll do a little North Africa as well. We're going 1200 to 2001. These are quick, like 12-minute review videos. 800 years of history in 12 minutes is impossible. I'm going to try and do it here. Let's see how this works out. First off, Circa, 1200 to 1450. Just a couple things about Africa in general. I feel like in the Western world, there's this stereotype of Africa. And really what you need to understand, maybe I'll break this stereotype, is that Africa is very diverse. There are thousands of languages and cultures and different ethnic groups. And because of the limitation of geographic barriers, whether it's desert, rainforest, savannas, like people were very separated throughout the early history of the development of Africa. So it's very diverse. For the most part, generally speaking, when most people look at Africa, they kind of break it down into multiple regions, but North Africa is usually seen as pretty separate from the rest of Africa because North Africa is separated by the Sahara Desert, and because North Africa is on the Mediterranean Sea, and because North Africa was part of the Islamic caliphates from pre-1200. There's just a different cultural connection with North Africa and the rest of Africa. So North Africa is part of the Muslim Empire. Sub-Saharan Africa is kind of really what we're going to focus on here. So I want to start with this Circa 1200 to 1450 and looking at the Mali Empire, which is one of our regional kingdoms. That's kind of one of the themes of 1200 to 1450, these different regional kingdoms that are involved in trade, but kind of separate from other regions and other areas. So in this case, we have the regional kingdom of the Mali Empire, which is located right here in West Africa. There were actually three different kingdoms between roughly like 1200 and all the way through really like the mid 1500s, and we have they are, just in case you ever see them, the Ghana Empire. You have the Mali Empire, which is concluded, the Ghana Empire and a little more, and then the Songhai, which comes after them, which is around 1500, which is the next time period, which is extended out. But the Mali Empire, all three of these kingdoms are located on the trans-Saharan trade route. So coming across the Sahara Desert here into North Africa to trade with people in North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, coming down because of the gold deposits. So there's a lot of gold deposits in West Africa. Obviously, gold is a source of currency for people, and there was so much gold in West Africa that it's believed that Mansa Musa was probably, who was one of the major leaders of the Mali Empire, one of the main figures, was probably one of the richest people ever to live. His wealth is almost impossible to even guesstimate. But he is, because it's on a trade route, and we talked about this in all of the videos, and this is one of the key themes of 1200, circa 1200 to 1450, is Islam spreading, and Islam spreads along trade routes because Islam, a lot of people who are Muslim and practice Islam are merchants. So Islam is going to spread down into West Africa, and a lot of the leaders and nobles convert to Islam in the Mali Empire. It's not full-fledged conversion like we see in some other regions, but there is a conversion of leaders because they see it is gaining kind of an advantage through trade and negotiations and whatnot. So Mansa Musa is kind of this pinnacle of this leader of this Mali Empire. He is going to convert to Islam, and Mansa means king in Arabic, and he is going to take a pilgrimage or a Hajj across the Sahara Desert. The Hajj, if you don't remember, is the pilgrimage that every Muslim, if you're financially and physically able, is supposed to go to Mecca. And he's going to bring a lot of ideas back with him, and he's going to spread gold, and he leads to inflation in Alexandria. There's a whole bunch of stories that go with this, but really the key I want to mention is Timbuktu during this time of Mansa Musa's reign really becomes a focal center point of learning in the world, especially in the Muslim world. It's really an important city to go to. And this is, just in case you ever see this pops up on pictures and AP exams. This is in the Mali Empire. This would be a mosque. You can see the minarets here, but definitely a different style than you see in kind of like in the Muslim Empire at this time, because this is not part of the Muslim Empire. It's part of where it spreads to. And also this is Mansa Musa here, a picture of him on a map, a European map. But also besides the west coast of Africa, if we went over here and my map extended, we would have the east coast of Africa. That is along the Indian Ocean trade route. Just a fun fact or friendly reminder, there is Swahili is going to be the language. This is a typo here. The Swahili is going to be the new culture that forms through syncretism of Arabic culture and language and Bantu culture. And Swahili is this new thing, or this new culture that emerges in East Africa. From 1450 to 1750, remember, we got the age of exploration going on. We have gunpowder empires going on. We have overseas or transoceanic empires happening in West Africa. They are involved in this trade. Europeans are coming along the coast. They're looking for slaves that they can put into the chattel slavery system, this harsh slave system that's going on in the Americas. And there are empires are going to grow in West Africa as a result of this. And the empires that grow are going to trade captured people, they're going to enslave people, sell them to the Europeans, and get guns in return. It's going to have a huge impact on this region because some people are going to be able to grow because of the gunpowder. The example here is the Asante Kingdom, which is located right here in West Africa. But also just the loss of people is kind of one of the key focal points here in sub-Saharan Africa. There's going to be the estimates are about 2/3 of the people who are going to be captured and enslaved are men, which leads to really a gender imbalance. It's going to have an impact on family structure issues in West Africa, where women are going to be given a more prominent role. But we're also going to see the beginning in some areas of kind of a polygamist or polygamy, where men are going to be able to marry multiple wives in order to kind of make up this difference where women can't find spouses because of the gender imbalance. It also just destabilizes the region. You're losing, I mentioned this when in the original video on this, but you're losing doctors, lawyers, educated people, kings, princes. It's not the people being captured aren't just poor peasants. We have people all across the board, and that really destabilizes what's going on in the region. Also, we do have Europeans setting up coastal trade areas. So this is not the best map to kind of look at here, but here's the Swahili coast. The Portuguese are going to kind of set up shop here because they are really involved in trade in India and Southeast Asia, and also on the coast here, in which is modern day Angola, which is going to have a communist revolution in the 1950s and 60s after their independence into their 70s. And this down here is South Africa. That is going to be a Dutch colony, but the British are going to come in during imperialism. And we also have just like little trade outposts along the coast here. So the Europeans are there. They have a presence. They can't penetrate into the interior of Africa because of diseases, malaria, yellow fever, things that are in the jungles of Africa that the Europeans can't. So they're really just on the coast at this point. 1750 to 1900, we have European and North American industrialization, and that leads eventually to imperialism. That's one of the effects of industrialization. And what we have in Africa is this time period often called the scramble for Africa, where Europeans, because of nationalism, economic motivations, religion, and social Darwinism, which is the belief that the lighter your skin, the more superior you are going to go out and try and conquer Africa. And they essentially, the first country to start this is Belgium. Belgium takes over the Congo here, which is, I think, 80 times, the Congo is 80 times larger than the country of Belgium. But Belgians have the weapons and the technology from industrialization. So they go in and they get in there by telling the king of the Congo, hey, I'm going to help stop the slave trade. I'm going to help getting your people captured. And then once the Belgian soldiers get in there, they overthrow and they kill the king of the Congo and they take it over. Horrible treatment in the Belgian Congo, one of the worst atrocities in human history. It's estimated, most historians kind of believe today that about 10 million people are going to die as a result of the Belgians conquering the Congo. We're going to have the cutting off of hands if you don't work hard enough. People from the Congo are going to be brought into Belgian zoos. Just a horrifically awful treatment of people in sub-Saharan Africa. After the Belgians colonized, the rest of the Europeans are like, we want a piece of that too. So they hold a conference in Berlin called the Berlin Conference, and they decide to split up the continent. This is how the continent is split up. Similar to what we talked about with the mandate system in the Middle East, if you've been watching a lot of these videos, this split is not done taking anyone's ethnicity or religious beliefs in mind. So the Europeans just create this map, and when independence eventually happens, it's going to lead to a lot of issues in these countries because the people who live there don't necessarily like each other. So it's going to lead to a lot of internal war and who gets a vote in democracy and stuff like that. We do have these settler colonies. These are areas like, for example, in South Africa where the Europeans are going and settling as opposed to just running a country for economic reasons. So we have a larger 10%, 15%-ish population of Europeans in South Africa where, for example, in maybe the Belgian Congo, it might be more like 1% of the population. Just as a reminder, I said this with the Belgian Congo, but overall in Africa, we have a horrible treatment of African people by the colonizing powers, by the Europeans, much worse than we see in India or Southeast Asia or East Asia. This is really the worst, and that connects back to social Darwinism and this belief that Europeans are superior to non-white people, and the darker your skin, the less advanced you are, just straight up racism. Also, there is resistance to this. Not everyone's like, hey, come on and please conquer us, Europeans. Most people are resisting. So there's two ways. You have armed struggle or armed rebellion. For example, the Italians go into Ethiopia here, Abyssinia, and they try and invade, and the Ethiopians beat them and send them back to Italy. So there is armed struggle. There's also religious rebellion. And one example of the religious rebellion is the Xhosa cattle killing in South Africa, where a young girl gets a vision that the only way to get the British out of South Africa is to slaughter all the cattle in the Xhosa tribe. And for some reason, people buy into it, and it does not work. The British still stay there. But that's just an example of a type of rebellion. Last but not least is, I'm on Kwame Nkrumah here. Last but not least is kind of these two phases that we talked about in these areas that were colonized. The first is like the World Wars period and then the post-World War. So during the World Wars, the colonies, similar to what we saw in Southeast Asia and South Asia, the colonies are promised independence if they help fight on behalf of their mother country. And African people sign up to volunteer because they want their independence. And when after World War I is over, they don't get it. And then after World War II is over, they don't get it right away. And this leads to really an increase in this idea of nationalism or decolonization. We want our independence. You shouldn't be in charge of us anymore. Also, just an example of this kind of nationalist movement, we see the African National Congress in South Africa. And we see these like nationalist groups pop up throughout Africa to promote independence. Some people are educated in Europe. These are mainly people who are kind of show great promise to the Europeans. So they're sent back to Paris or London or Berlin for an education, and then they come back with nationalist ideas because they're interacting with Europeans about democracy and enlightenment and all those fun things that we've talked about throughout this course. Almost at post-World War II, we see the beginnings of independence. Some people negotiate their independence, especially in a lot of the British colonies, and then in other areas, people are forced to have armed struggle. Not that this is the greatest map, but if you ever look at the time periods, there's really this push around 1957 through the 1960s, and a lot of that is negotiated early on. Some of these countries down in sub-Saharan Africa really have to fight for their independence, especially in the Portuguese-controlled areas and in the French-controlled areas down here in the South. These are really like 1970s, and there's a lot of armed struggle. They're kind of like 13 years later, like, bro, we still haven't gotten our independence, so they're going to fight for it. So the theme is West Africa negotiates. A lot of the Sub-Saharan and East Africa are forced to fight for it. And just one last piece of this, two last pieces. One is in South Africa, we have the apartheid system, just an example of a place. That apartheid system is going to last until 1991. It's the segregation of whites and blacks, and Nelson Mandela is the leader, and there's the African National Congress, and eventually Mandela is elected president in 94. There's a lot of discrimination in housing and jobs and schools and all that good stuff, and you can't travel where you want if you're not white. There's that. The one last piece I just want to point out, and this comes up on the AP exam sometimes, and I haven't really mentioned this in these Cram videos, is that these new nationalist leaders we see dress a certain way, and a lot of ways they dress kind of symbolizes what they represent and who they are. This is Kwame Nkrumah. He's the first president of Ghana. He was the leader of the independence movement in Ghana to negotiate with the British. This is a picture of him in kind of his traditional clothing, showing like his roots to Ghana and to West Africa, dressing in traditional clothing. But this is him in the United States meeting with, I believe, President Eisenhower at the time, and he's dressed in a suit and tie, which is very Western. You can see I'm wearing a tie right now. It's very Western to wear a tie, and it shows that he is connected to this Western culture. So sometimes it pops up a picture of somebody. Depending upon the clothes they're wearing, they are similar. Like if you see a picture of Castro, he's only wearing a military uniform. A lot of communists wear military uniforms, showing kind of the power and the military oriented. You will look at the President of the United States, he's always wearing a shirt and tie. So that's kind of, just always pay attention to the clothing. Just one last reminder. That's what I got on Africa. Almost 14 minutes on this one. Any questions, let me know. I'm out.